Alrighty, good morning, everyone. Welcome to SpaceGeekSpeak, to this wonderful end of July. As you know, today we're celebrating Apollo 15, and I would call it Apollo 15 and Power of Inspiration. Apollo was a very special mission because from the scientific perspective, after the geopolitical goals were achieved with stepping on the moon and being first with getting to the moon, now it became the time for scientific exploration. And the Apollo 15 ended up to be bringing the car on the moon. Let me share real quickly before Judy will join. I prepared a very small PowerPoint. And I think you're seeing my slides. Hold on. Okay, so yeah. So as I said, that Apollo 15 was one of the 3 missions where—
I can't see your slide, sorry.
Where we used rovers. And that's essentially put the car, American car makers, onto the moon. And do you see? I'm sorry. I think you're seeing the Zoom screen, right?
Right.
Okay. This should be better. I'm trying to double on both. Huh. Interesting. So let's go with Judy's presentation talk, and then I will go through my slides. It's a little becoming slightly challenging, more challenging than I expected. Judy, I will start sharing.
Okay, I don't plan to show any slides until afterwards.
Okay.
But you guys can hear me, I think. And this is a story from Apollo 15, and actually it's a couple of decades old. It originated with trying to capture some of the social aspects of space exploration as people knew it back, say, in the late 1990s, which is still after the fact. So the story is just intended more as a STEM kind of outreach, but I think it will bring up some topics that we could discuss in more detail later for the science part that you guys are interested in. So here goes. Back in 1985, a telephone on the astromaterials curator's desk rang, and a voice on the other end said, "May I bring my mother and my son to the lab tomorrow to see the Genesis rock?" And the curator chuckled because he didn't normally do that kind of thing. The Genesis rock was kept in a nitrogen glove box inside of a vault, inside of a very clean room. But in this case, the curator said, "We would be honored to have you visit," because the caller was Jim Irwin, the very person who found the rock on the moon. So that was set up. And they did come to visit. To backtrack just a little bit, as Svetlana has talked about, this was the 4th crew to set foot on the moon, the first of the J missions, which were enhanced science, including enhanced transportation with the rover. But these guys were also extensively trained in geology. Now, all of the astronauts were, but they had been trained and were really gung-ho to get out there and find the rock that the science guys wanted. And by the time of preparation for Apollo 15, they had examined some earlier rocks, so they knew a little bit about the moon, but they were really anxious to find a piece of the ancient lunar crust to give them some insight into how the moon first formed. So they had studied all this up. Apollo 15 comes in over the Apennine Mountains and lands on the volcanic plain at the foot, which had been a rather interesting descent, I think. They suit up, they get out, and they have the rover. Now, these two guys who are primed to go find the rocks that the geologists wanted had the mobility to go further. They could go many places much faster. So on the day that they started up the mountain collecting rocks, and they worked, as you guys that do crew system stuff know, in the spacesuits, there was a little bit of exertion and the whirring of the spacesuit fans and the staticky communications with mission control. And at some point up on the mountain, they turned around and looked back over that volcanic plain. And the rover looked so tiny in the far distance. And for Jim Irwin, this was a spiritual moment, a moment of incredible beauty, all this stark landscape, and he felt closer to God at that time. And he actually quoted, "I will lift up mine eyes into the hills from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth." And of course, I get a lot of help from mission control too, he quipped. But you can probably imagine that feeling if you've been on a mountaintop or a quiet forest or a beach that gave you a lot of peace. Shortly after that, Jim Irwin spotted a fist-size white rock sitting up on a pedestal of dirt. And the light glinting off of it looked like a large crystalline white rock. He and Dave Scott kind of got excited, bumped elbows, and reported, "We think we found what we came for." Well, they had found an old white crystalline rock. And when they got back, people were excited to examine it. But Jim Irwin came back also with a new approach to his life. You may know that he became an ordained Baptist minister after that. And he was part of a foundation called High Flight Foundation. And they had a little brochure. And on it, he talked about finding that white rock. He said, "God guided us to this discovery of the white rock, the Genesis rock. The rock was sitting on another rock, almost free from dust. It was lifted up and gleaming in the sunlight. It seemed to be saying, 'Here I am, take me.'" So back to that phone call in 1985 when Jim brought his mother and his son to visit the lunar lab, and they suited up to enter the lab, which is a very clean laboratory, totally gowned, their faces exposed, but also, other than that, capped, covered gloves. And one by one, they walked up and peered through the glass window on the nitrogen glove box to look at the Genesis rock that Jim Irwin so proudly showed to his family. And he later asked if he could meet with the geologists that had been studying the rock there in Building 31 on site. And everyone packed the room. The conference room wasn't that big. There were quite a few people there. And he talked about, he was showing some slides about what he was using to show the public. And he turned around and he said, "What have you discovered about the Genesis rock?" And everyone in the room knew that this was very important to this kind and gentle man. But it was a fairly long, silent pause. And finally someone said, "Well, that rock has been heated so hot hot and beat up so badly by impacts that we're still working on deciphering the story that rock has to tell. That was 1985, and Jim Irwin passed away in 1991. And since then, the techniques have improved, and the best date for that rock was 4.2 billion years old, and it was a piece of old lunar crust, and they were starting to interpret it. Now, Jim didn't live to see that come out, but they brought back 369 samples, and he did get to see a lot of things from those samples that was accomplished before he passed away. So when I talk to people about this story, I ask them to look at the moon, up at the right eye of the man in the moon, right where a tear would form, and that's place Jim Irwin and Dave Scott left their footprints and a perfectly good dune buggy. So that's my story. And I have some links if you're interested in the geology training that these guys received. There's a very good NASA SP written by Bill Finney. It covers all of the training, geology training that they did for astronauts. It's broken out by mission and where the people went. There's quite a few quotes on how the astronauts viewed their geology training. Some were very enthusiastic. Some were not quite so enthusiastic. But Dave Scott and Jim Irwin were very enthusiastic. And Dave Scott especially still remains today interested in the science being learned from those samples and has spoke at a fairly recent lunar science conference as a keynote speaker in the time before the pandemic. So Svetlana, that's all I have. Unless I want to show that NASA SP, and there's also a link to something new that's on the Astromaterials curation page. They've got, it's called Astromaterials 3D, and you can look at Apollo rocks or meteorites in 3D, and they have X-ray type composition slices through the rocks. It's really quite cool. So let me see if I can share that with you. That's it. Are you seeing a screen that has science training history, the Apollo astronauts on it? Okay, that bottom picture across the bottom, and there's is Dave Scott and Jim Irwin standing on the rim of Rio Grande Gorge out near Taos, New Mexico. That NASA SP, which you can download, it's NASA SP-2015-626 by William C. Finney. And it has a lot of detail and enough commentary, you get a sense of personalities as well. The right-hand side of that screen is the link for the Astromaterials 3D. This is the Apollo collection page. If you go there, you can pull up a rock and rotate it yourself. The image is quite good. It's like being able to hold it in your hand and look at the chemistry. Not every single Apollo rock is in that collection. They're still working on adding to it, so I recommend that. Okay, that's all I have.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you. Appreciate your coming here and telling us a story about the rock and how that and the history of the rock itself. I actually did find the rock itself, the picture that is of that rock, and let me see if I can share now again successfully this time. This presentation.
It's sample 15415. You can go online, and those of you and look it up in the Apollo catalog.
Right, and so again, I will just run a little bit through some of the historical perspective that the Apollo 15 was one of the most productive scientifically, from scientific side expeditions. The Apollo 15 left Earth for the moon on July 26, 50 years ago, and this mission gave us a new template for the human exploration. Apollo 15 was one of the first of the extended Apollo J missions. It carried more fuel, more life support capability, and the rover, as well as a variety of scientific equipment. And speaking about scientific equipment, that the rover was landed with astronauts on the moon, and essentially American auto was on the moon at that point. Some of the green colored lunar soil that was retrieved from the moon by Apollo 15, you see on the screen right now, that during Apollo 15 was collected total of 170 pounds of material, and most lunar samples returned to Earth by the final Apollo mission never would have been collected if the astronauts had not brought a car with them. And speaking about the Genesis rock, so here you see that the picture of a Genesis rock, thank you to NASA for putting samples on the website. And that's the sample, as Judy mentioned, 15016, or the more affectionately dubbed seed belt basalt.
Let me, the 15016 is not the Genesis rock.
Okay,
It is
the
the
Genesis
seed
rock
belt.
right now on the right hand
Right.
side. Yes.
15415.
Correct, yes. And so on the next picture, you see that David Scott, commander of Apollo 15, and Joseph Allen, a fourth Apollo spacecraft communicator, looking at the Genesis rock after the mission. And this is from the Life magazine. You see the Apollo 15 crew, their Corvettes, and the moon rover. And also Mr. Scott waited in the rover for Mr. Irvin to return with samples collected near the Hadley Upper Nine landing site for the ride back to the lunar module on August 1st, 1971. And here's some other historical perspective. And when we go to the moon, return to the moon in 2024, and after that, we will yet again see these trucks that lunar rover left on lunar surface. Mission managers planned for the rover to travel only as far as astronauts could walk, in case anything happened and they had to walk back. And here's a little historical perspective that is connecting us with today's mission, that it's really inspirational, especially working on Artemis, on Gateway program, that we are indeed going to the moon, and we are going to the moon to learn and how to live on other planets and for the benefits of all humanity. With the Artemis lunar exploration program, NASA will be putting the first woman and the first person of color on the lunar surface and build a sustainable presence there and in the lunar orbit. There was a report that, so lately in society, we have talked about the value of human spaceflight and how important, and the debate about the importance of it. There was a report about 5 years ago released by National Research Council on human spaceflight specifically highlighted human spaceflight's undeniable ability to inspire students, how it can touch them personally and propel them intellectually and academically toward productive careers. Can one truly quantify the value of inspiration, that power and influence that ignites passion in others? There was a whole generation that can recall where they were exactly when Apollo landing was on TV, and the impact on that generation was immeasurable. In the press conference after the mission Apollo 15, Commander Dave Scott quoted Plutarch as saying, "The mind is now a vessel, is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be lighted." That quotation nicely summarizes both the Apollo 15 mission itself and how it has affected lives of so many. And now, if anyone would like to say anything, or I will stop sharing. And maybe, yes, I think I stopped sharing.
Svetlana, I have a couple of comments. When you guys look again at pictures of the rover, you'll notice there's a tool rack on the back of the lunar rover. And that's where the tongs and the rakes, and there's a couple of sample bags hanging there. And prior to that, they had to hang the bags on their plisses in the back. So one neat thing about having that rover, it was like working out of the trunk of your car to go get your tools for when you get a picnic. So I think that's neat. And on this training, geology training for the astronauts, they started to involve the mission managers. So they would have a feel for what was going on the moon. So that was a big plus. And Genesis Rock, you know why it got its name, Genesis of the Moon. Seatbelt Rock, that has a good story about its name. The crew is supposed to get back inside very fast, just, get back in the limb. And Dave Scott saw that rock, and he stopped the rover, got off and picked it up. And when Mission Control asked what was he doing, he said, "Oh, I was having trouble with my seatbelt."
Yeah, that's cool.
Well, I have a question for Judy. And I'm kind of wondering, when they first saw that rock, they were still in the lunar buggy, right? They didn't get out of the buggy right away. They saw it from the buggy, and it struck them because I think it was white. But how did they know it was so old? How did they know it was the Genesis rock they were looking for?
That was mainly a description. It was white, and if I understood this right, and you may know better, it was let me back up. The geologists were looking for ancient lunar crust made mostly from plagioclase mineral that would have floated to the top early in the moon's formation and cooled slowly enough, they thought, to make big crystals. So they were asking the folks to find a white crystalline rock with fairly large crystals. And the way Erwin described it in his brochure about, the gleaming, it was the glint off a crystal face. And if you look at, if you have a clean crystal face, you're going to get a shiny reflection off of it. And they were, observant enough to pick that up. So that met their criteria: large crystal white rock. They did not know how old it was till they got it back. And even then it was hard to measure, because the way you date the rocks has to do with tracing, mostly radioactive decay products that accumulate with time. And because of the high heating from impacts and just tearing it up, it was really hard to decipher. That's why it took so long to work their way through that. There are other similar rocks of the crystalline type, and they come in about that age. There's some slight variation, but not much. Does that help? I really don't know for sure. and you talk like you've studied the transcript more closely, whether he was sitting in the rover or standing around collecting stuff at the same time.
I just, I'm just taking off from what your presentation gave us. And so they saw this white rock, and it attracted their attention because it met all the criteria they were looking for. But it's funny that they only saw one, or did they see other smaller rocks that are the same kind around the area? It's funny that there was just that one rock sitting there.
Well, I can't tell you about the collection, and you can go look at the things that were collected. That got their attention possibly because it was perched on a pedestal of soil, and it just happened to be oriented right with the sunlight coming in, and they just happened to be looking at it. And so from that standpoint, you can kind of see where Jim Irwin might have said, well, God guided me to find this, because his mindset was sort of set up for thinking like that.
Okay, thank you.
But I think, Mike, as an answer to your question, pretty much any rock they would pick up from the moon would be old.
Very old, yeah.
Yes.
Touche, good point.
And
Yeah,
also the benefits of picking up the materials for studying that from the lunar surface, unlike on the Earth, there is no wind on the lunar surface, and therefore there's hardly any atmosphere. And so because of that, whatever gets dropped as a meteorite onto the surface is not changing its even outer portion of the cover of the rocks. And I may not sound or say it in the scientific terms as Judy would be able to say, but therefore that all the materials present rich soil for scientific discovery to learn the history of the universe from the trace materials and so on. And knowing exactly where those materials came from, well, as exactly as is possible based on our capabilities, scientific capabilities at the moment. But whatever as a micro or as a meteorites get dropped onto the ground, into the Earth surface, it has to go through the layers of atmosphere, and therefore a lot of the material gets burned. Only the inner parts that now available for discovery. So with the lunar materials that being brought in, it's undisturbed, and there's no change with the going through the layers of atmosphere happens. Frank, you probably have some stories from those days too, because you actually had a chance to meet with I assume with the people that we're talking to. As I said, that those that were born prior 1971, they actually, if they remember those days, that meaning that they were not newborns, that they know exactly where they were. I did not have a chance to actually remember where I was in 1971. And some of our participants, like Donna, she has the ability to learn about it only through you guys. And so I'm thrilled to see that Frank Hughes also joined us, and Mike Helton joined us, and of course Judith. Thank you. And so if you have you have an opportunity to share, please do. We would like to listen to hear your story.
I really enjoyed the story that Judy had for us. It was kind of interesting. Mike, I'm sorry, Jim Irwin came back really religious. I mean, he was before, but he really felt that something really special had changed his life during that trip. But along the way, a couple of stories at Apollo 15. First of all, the Boeing built that rover, okay? So it had some piece parts from other automotive groups because they didn't want to spend the time of fixing everything, but it was Boeing as the chief contractor to put it all, integrate it all together. And sometime it'd be interesting to take one of your mornings and find, I have some pictures, but to try to see how it was assembled. That is how, when they took it out on the moon, it was a really interesting kind of thing because it was folded up into a very small container that's actually a trapezoid, a triangle. The wheels had to fold together to go into this thing. And it was all folded up in some really interesting things. Something that's like origami. You have to see it to believe it, where they unfolded it and put it down on the moon. But that's not one of the biggest things that we got into from the training business is these guys were well trained and ready to go do it. They've been working as far as the geology, of course, but then we had to make sure they knew how to fly, how to land, and successfully how to get back out of there. And this was the second flight after 13. So there's a lot of things going on. One of them is the people coming back during 13 didn't eat very much. I mean, they were in tough shape coming back. But for 15, the people on the ground, the food service people, really worked on making the food taste better. Okay, they worked a lot on that stuff. And so that was the first flight with this set of things. And it turns out they flew off to the moon, but the problem was they did not have enough potassium on board. As the crew went into it, of course, it doesn't matter, right? They're kind of just loafing around in the command module until they get into orbit. So when the two guys who came down in the suit, and Judy said that, you're sweating at the storm because you're working hard to do everything. Well, they started sweating out all their remaining electrolytes. And the first EVA was just a stand-up EVA, did a 360 that Jim did, I'm sorry, that Dave did, looking around outside using the upper hatch. And they did that because people on the ground were interesting, that Jim was beginning to show some PVCs, some premature ventricular contractions. He, by the way, he died ultimately of heart failure. So, I mean, he was preset for a lot of things like that. Anyway, then they went out on the day 2, they went out on the ground and went uphill, just as said, they went up on the side of Mount Hadley. And they did everything good. They've got lots and lots of good things and so on. But, and those adventures that you talked about, the Genesis rock. And then on day 3, they went to hill. The rill is actually, Hadley Rill is a very deep valley, pretty steep slopes, but very heavily sandy. That is, it was not like the edge of a Grand Canyon, which is really hard rock. The ground is soft and beat up by a lot of micrometeorites, so coming down all the time. So it's like soft sand. And on that trip, they almost got too far down. The rover almost tipped over. So the slope was just a little bit too much. And they had to just grab it and step on the upper side of it and hold it down. And they also had trouble getting back out of there. They were almost down so far in that very loose terrain that they were having trouble skidding up. There was a 4-wheel drive, so that's part of the good deal. But actually, they get on, and Dave drove the thing back out of there with Jim walking, at least part of the trip, just to make sure that they were back to a better retention and a lower slope. Anyway, now they're really in bad shape. And in fact, at the end of that EVA, the doctors on the ground were really, because now both of them were throwing PVCs, these premature ventricular contractions, kind of like an incipient heart attack. And so they got them out of there, got them back to the command module, and everybody quit doing whatever, and they gave them whatever they had directed them to add or to eat, whatever they thought had a little more potassium in it. Okay, so they were working this in real time, but they came home successfully, not a problem. Well, the story goes on because in Apollo 16, everybody, of course, NASA reacts, this is the people that think belt and suspenders is a better deal, they're both. So they loaded up every item of food with potassium, everything, the orange juice, everything. So, and the problem with that is that too much potassium does a couple of things. One is it makes everything taste like you're licking the bottom of an aluminum pot. Okay, just got that tang to it all. That part of it. And it also, the side effect is it gives you volumes of lots and lots of gas. And so there is a rich story, and you should find it on Apollo 16. Once John and what's his name landed on the moon, they went out on their first EVA. And when they got back in, at the end of the day, they signed off and said goodbye to everybody on the ground because they were going to sleep. They were going to stay these 3 days. All those J missions are 3 days. So anyway, they got going. And if you've ever been in the cold north where there's a lot of snow, you know, when your little kids come in, or if you did it yourself, somebody would come in and the first thing they did is give you something warm to drink. And of course, they were exhausted. They hadn't had food and anything for 6-7 hours. So they take the spacesuits and just like the snowsuits, they just push them down around your legs and so on. But the problem was, after they signed off from Earth, when they pushed their spacesuit down around their knees, the push to talk button was activated. So they, even though they thought they were through with the Earth, they were actually talking full time, and the ground was hearing everything they're saying. And John Young went on about, if you've ever heard it, this was so bad, I can't stand to be with myself in this spacesuit. I'm farting so bad, and it smells like oranges. And it goes on, but there's a lot more to this. That was F this and F that, and I'm never going to eat another orange in my entire life when I get home. And it goes on and on and on. And of course, this is live coming down. They can't stop them. And they were, of course, they're, you know, the Capcom saying, John, this is, you know, hot micro, things like nothing. They were not here because they'd taken off the things on their head. And so finally they sent a command to turn on the abort button on the panel. Now, the only thing the abort would made is if during your landing, you know, something's going on, but they had got their attention because they get a master alarm and this big red abort light comes on. And then told them, you know, they got, yeah, what's going on? You know, it's your hot mic, turn off Vox, you know, change it to take it off PTT or push to talk. So they were embarrassed, but it's for a long time, the transition, I mean, the transcription of that thing is very famous. And you could look up the Apollo 16 thing, it goes on like that. It turned out that the governor of Florida made a special announcement, put up a thing that says he wasn't talking about real oranges, he was talking about artificial orange juice. And it went on like this for days. It was very famous. So as many things as John did in his 6 flights, that's one of the ones that stands with him. People ask questions all the time. Another thing, though, just one more, and I'll stop, is that that flight also did something that is probably the most important thing in the long term, is that once they left the moon, one day out on the way back to Earth, they opened, they depressurized, and they did the first deep space EVA. Okay. All the time that Al Warden had been in orbit when they were working on the ground, we had augmented a sim bay full of cameras, and they were really good cameras. In fact, they were the best spy cameras that we had. And what it was doing, he was taking pictures for the future of all of the targets, the future things that they did within reach of the orbits that we had at that time on that flight. And but that whole thing, then Al went outside and went down the side of the command module, the service module, and grabbed these cassettes. He had to make 3 trips to grab these cassettes and bring them back in and hand them to Dave inside the cockpit. And so that, if you think about all those flights or all those pictures where that in deep space, people are outside the thing. I mean, he's there, there's no horizon where he's at, you know. There's a small moon over this way and a small Earth over that way, and he's out in nothing. And so he's the first of 3 guys. That was done on each of the flights for the last 3, 15, 16, 17. But it was really good. And by the way, that it was a big thing. They went through that before they put those things there, because those are some of our most secret things in U.S. You know, technology. And so it was okay by putting in that service module, these things were destroyed on the way home. That is, they flew straight into the atmosphere and burned up. So we never had a risk of somebody recover any of those cameras. There you go.
Thank you, Frank. That's always a pleasure, of course, to hear the Apollo days. And maybe perhaps in future, some of the meetings that you can, I know you have a model of the service module and also I've seen how you, to some of the interns, you would describe how it's exactly folded and how it's, once it was released, the unfolding. And it's fascinating, the thought process and engineering process of creating this in order to maximize or the space utilization and minimize the volume and so on. It's just amazing solutions that came from the Apollo exploration. You're muted. Yeah. Frank, you're muted.
I remember. I remember during the Apollo 16 mission that there were some discussions about a hot mic and everything, but I didn't know the details and the background of what was going on there. I thought maybe somebody said a bad word, and so they were reminding each other that the mic is on. But that didn't bother me. I was an engineer and I was working for North American Rockwell. My concern was that the astronauts were not in any trouble and are going to be able to get back okay and everything. But so I didn't care whether the mic was on or off or anything like that. But I do remember some discussions there, but I didn't know what was going on. So 50 years later, now I find out.
Yeah, why don't you go back, see if you can find in the transcription of all the air to ground during that first day on the moon. It was.
And matter of fact, the same with Judy. I remember when the news came out that they found the rock they were looking for, and I thought, well, how could they know that they found the rock they were looking for, especially if they're on the moon buggy, and so that just sounded like a made up, thing that they were just kind of promoting the exploration of the moon. That oh, look at this, and oh, look at that, oh, such a great thing. And I thought, well, come on, I don't know that they were just making something up or that they really found something that was truly amazing. So now, 50 years later, I learned all the details about it, and I can appreciate it then.
Well, and those guys, that crew was very voluble. That is, they were excited, and they, especially if they were told to look for orange rocks or they're looking for crystalline rocks. When they finally saw one, something like that, that's when they would go crazy.
Yeah.
Excuse me. The finding of the green soil was a surprise. Because the green soil is comprised of very tiny glass spheres, and they're perfectly round. They're Coke bottle green. They're roughly 200 micron spheres. So they're best seen through a microscope. And because they're formed in a fire fountain, a volcanic fire fountain. It's the same process as the orange soil on Apollo 17 that you remember. So when a volcano would release, liquid that would condense into small droplets, because there's no atmosphere, they're perfectly round. And really, most of those don't have a lot of dust stuck in them. A lot of the other lunar glasses from impacts are coated with dust grains, and they don't look nearly as pretty. And most of those are black, trashy things. But the green glass spheres and the orange spheres on Apollo 17 are absolutely gorgeous under a microscope.
Yeah, the finding the specific rock was not, I think the directive was to find something that is measurable big, but it's not necessarily was given specifics on the color or the size or the age of the rock. As I said, everything is old in there, way older than we expect, and then some probably. But then the size and the manner that that rock presents itself, and with Genesis rock, they definitely hit the home run for that particular the way it looked and the way it felt. Well, thank you both, Frank, Judy, and Mike, that you're people that experienced that time and experienced interaction with the with crew members that had an opportunity to step on the moon, to leave those footprints or the rover trucks on the moon. And now I guess it's our turn, like that those that are working within the gateway, to interact with the new set of astronauts, with the future crew members for the exploration missions on the moon, and carry on that the flag of exploration. So I really wanted to thank you guys, and thank you for sharing, and just know that you're always welcome on this forum every Saturday. We keep it open 8:30 every morning, Saturday morning that is, and anyone is welcome. Bring a story to share, have some coffee like I'm drinking right now, and yes, and or water, your choice of beverage that appropriate for the morning, or whether you're joining right now from Houston, from other area in United States, or like some of our members, Douglas, joining us from France at the moment. So it's that thanks to Zoom, thanks to virtual environment, we are able to join from anywhere. There's literally no limits on what location you can join. You don't have to get up early. You don't have to drive somewhere. Just get up and join. And I also want to thank Blanca that had joined us today. She's just like Douglas, she's also an educator, and she is sharing knowledge and preparing future explorers for their difficult jobs of exploration, both on the ground and in space. And Vladimir, first time I see your name. Well, welcome to the SpaceGeekSpeak. I don't know how you found us, but however you found us, you found us. So please join us today and join us in future meetings. Is there anything else you guys would like to ask, share, that whether it's related to Apollo 15 or to other missions? No. Okay, before we finish for today, I wanted to mention that next week we have another distinguished speaker. Alice Bowman will be coming to present on the Pluto mission, and I cannot wait. It's a little bit further than the moon, but it's just as interesting, and exploration is just exciting as exploring lunar surface. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I will place this recording to the YouTube, to the SpaceGeekSpeak channel. So if you would like to either rerun it, share it with your students, Blanca, or just in future refresh your memory and with the stories from Apollo 15. And thank you so much. We'll see you next time.